appreciate it. Well, on behalf of my dear friend Paula, thank you all for coming this evening. We really appreciate it. And, you know, Paula and I are sort of meant to be emblematic of something that Confluence was designed to do, which is to take people from various parts of the creative spectrum and get them to think about common issues in ways that previously just had not really been the case. I mean, Paula and I have been on the faculty at the U of A for a while, and yet it wasn't really until Confluence came together that we started sort of thinking about the ways in which her discipline in music and mine in archaeology might actually have common ground. And so we thought that, excuse me, it would be a good idea to sort of use that as a segue into thinking together, us, tonight, about a topic that impinges very directly on what both of us do. So Javier mentioned a moment ago the lovely hand-bound booklet in front of you, and I want to call your attention to that because there are some notes inside that I'm going to be referring to as part of my presentation. At the very end, in the back cover, there's also an additional reading list. I mean, I apologize for being pedantic, but I am a professor, and so, you know, you never know. You might go away and want to do a little extra reading. There you go. But there will not be an exam. The rest of the booklet is blank, simply for you to use in whatever way you might want to use a notebook. So to help us think about this topic, I thought I'd just sort of talk you through a little bit of the historical context in which anthropologists, including archaeologists, have come to think about what culture is and how we define what humanity is today. Because as recently, and I stress the word recently as the 1970s when I was in graduate school, the definition of what constituted humanity was set out in terms of a contrast. This is what humans are, and we're different than everybody else. And secondly, it was very clear what that dividing line was. And so in the 1970s, what was very clear, and it sort of made archaeologists happy, was that it's all about tools, right? And using tools is what really separates people from everybody else. Well, you know, with biological anthropology sort of providing a genetic perspective on the question beginning in the late 1980s, archaeologists sort of revised that idea and started going back to the basics and thinking about the larger issue of the role that culture plays in human adaptation. And so there was a generation of archaeologists in the 1980s that said, well, it's not just about using tools, because like, I mean, Darwin knew that little finches and stuff used tools, right? And, you know, sea otters bashing open shells on it. That's not the issue. So they sort of upped the ante and said, well, it's not just using tools, it's making tools. So unless you can make tools like these hand axes, you know, something like that, you're not really human. And of course, we now know that lots of non-humans, including non-primates, make tools. They not just use them, they also make them. I was just reading last week about some parrot someplace. I should have read in more detail, obviously. Some parrot someplace that uses a thorn to modify another thorn that's the actual tool it's going to use. So that didn't work. And then as recently as the 1990s, archaeologists, in one last sort of spasm, sort of desperation, said, well, it's not about using tools, and it's not about making tools. It's about making tools to make other tools. And by that time, a lot of us were either completely bored with the argument, or were more interested in figuring out something to do with how human beings adapt. And that actually, when you get to the core of it, it's not so much sort of setting up a distinction of us versus them, you know, we share 99.9% of our genetic heritage with the orangutan, and but it's that other 0.1% that's the critical thing. Yeah, exactly. So archaeologists sort of found themselves being drawn back into the anthropological fold, going back to basics and thinking about the concept of culture. And culture is an adaptive mechanism. Now, this sort of gets at one of the illustrations that is in your little handbook that I want you to look at, which is this one, right? It's right in the front. And, there are several things that we can say about culture as an adaptive mechanism. First of all, I would propose that whatever it is, culture is uniquely human. Okay? That there are lots of other critters out there, for example, including other primates, non-primates, that do very sophisticated stuff, some of which human beings do, including communicate. But I'm maintaining, and I hope you'll agree with me by the end of the discussion, that whatever it is, culture is uniquely human. Second of all, culture is learned, right? This gets at the issue that was all courant not too long ago about whether or not culture is just biological. It's hardwired in you, and you have no choice. That's a ridiculous concept that's easily dispensed with, because you can choose to be whatever culture you want to be, right? Yeah. Right now, I've decided I want to be Japanese. There's nothing to prevent me from doing it. It's going to be really, really hard work, and it's going to take years and years of learning the rules. But there's nothing biological that prevents me from saying, okay, put everything else on the back burner. I'm done with the Norwegian-American thing. Full on Japanese, and let's do it, right?
There's a song about that, right?
There is, actually,
Yeah.
which Paul is going to sing.
I am.
No.
I'm not going to be Japanese.
She's not.
I have a head start on you.
That's right. You have a head start on it. However, we also have to recognize, though, that in part what makes culture such a wonderful adaptive mechanism may come down to what biologists call a pre-adaptation. So even if it's not hardwired in as biologically, you will be French, you will be Japanese, you will be whatever. The pre-adaptation to sort of use those kinds of social mechanisms to define who we are and how we maneuver through our sort of social environment probably is. So there is a biological component, but not in the way that most people think of it, as in you were born into a particular culture. Somehow, the biology is what determines it. Okay, point number 3, which is clearly related to number 2, is that culture is cumulative and it is transmitted. The means of transmission is this thing called language, right? So it's not just learning the rules, but it's also transmitting those rules in a way that everybody else understands through time, generationally, right? So that every brand new generation of Norwegians doesn't have to figure out how to be Norwegian from scratch. They know that stuff. They have to eat horrible rotting fish, and we know the rules, right? We totally know the rules.
The Americans are still figuring it out.
Right. And then fourth, and most importantly, culture has moral force. Now, moral force is a phrase that anthropologists use, has nothing to do with morality in the sort of colloquial American sense of David Petraeus or something. Yeah, no, it's moral force has to do with recognized rules of the road, and I mean that literally, right? So there's nothing magical, there's nothing biologically encoded about going out on Grant here on the way home and knowing that when the red light turns, or when the light turns red, you stop. And everybody does that because culture has moral force. That's a cultural phenomenon. You may not know this, it'll be relevant to you too, is that Mao Zedong in the 1960s experimented around with some of these moral force issues that had unfortunate results. He had a group of his colleagues, I don't know what you call them, come together, Joanne Lai and so forth, And Mao Zedong was a strange man by that time. He probably had early onset Alzheimer's, but it was very difficult to understand. And strange man. And he said, looked around this table, great hall of people, and he said, "What is the color of socialism?" Everybody's sort of looking at each other like, I don't know what the color of socialism is. And finally, some little voice in the back says, "Chairman Mao, red is the color of socialism." Right, exactly. All right, everybody's happy, no problems. And then a second later he says, "What is the color of capitalism?" And finally somebody says, "Green, like the American dollar?" Mao Zedong says, "Yes, exactly, right." So everybody's happy, right? Mao Zedong says next, "Therefore, we want socialism to be progressive, and we want to stop capitalism. So beginning tomorrow morning, red lights will mean go, and green lights will mean stop." Well, I mean, I can only say that, thank goodness, in 1969 or whenever this was, there were only 4 cars in Beijing. Immediately all over China there were major traffic accidents because, moral force had nothing to do with what Mao Zedong was talking about, right? It was just this idea that every place has the same rules. There is no place on the planet on which you go when it is red and you stop when it is green. Right? That's what moral force is all about. Now, there are lots of fairly sophisticated, even cybernetic ways of representing what culture is and how it works. But I choose the very sophisticated section grapefruit model. Because actually I think it works as well as a more sophisticated model does, and it demonstrates something very organic about culture, literally, right? It gets you to think about how organic it is. So if you think for a minute that culture as an adaptive mechanism can still be broken into constituent parts, and we can label them: language and religion and politics and social organization or kinship, whatever, technology. If you take those labels and you attach them to the individual segments in the section grapefruit, you realize that, even though they are separate, they're interacting, right? The membranes between the segments are permeable. All of those segments come together at the central point. So even if they are at opposite ends of the grapefruit, they still touch at the center. That's pretty much what culture looks like. So that, for example, we might say, what's the relationship between religion and politics? There is no relationship between religion and politics. And so, but in some cultures, medieval Tibet, for example, religion was politics. Politics was religion. They were completely indistinguishable concepts, right? So the idea of theocratic rule is part of some cultural traditions. And yet in others, so if we were to draw a graph of medieval Tibetan culture, maybe we'd put politics and religion right next to each other in this section grapefruit. But in other contexts, like modern America, maybe we put them on opposite sides of the grapefruit because we have, for example, constitutional reasons to separate church and state. And yet all of us recognize that there are influences on politics by religion, on religion by politics. So they are never completely separate. This means that in terms of providing human beings with a mechanism for adaptation, this section grapefruit model emphasizes the flexibility of the system. That it's possible to reach into one part of that system and really screw around with it and change it quite a bit. Maybe the economic part of the system, right? We overthrow our, try and go hyper-Marxist on you here, and I've forgotten the terminology. We, throw off the chains of our oppressors, and we are no longer the yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, other aspects of the culture remain unchanged, right? So that we don't have to throw everything out just because we go into the system and modify one part of it.
That's what Miles did.
So, classic example. So, I brought some objects for you to look at tonight, mostly, obviously, after I'm done talking at you, which will happen very soon, I promise, to demonstrate something. And I chose something, i.e. stone tools, specifically to demonstrate that the simplest human technology, the technology that goes back to the very beginnings of human culture at all, stone technology, might just be the best technology to demonstrate what really is the salient difference between what human beings do and what everybody else does. And that gets down to the idea of symbols. Right? Archaeology, anthropologists in general actually take the word symbols as a noun and turn it into a verb and talk about symbolizing. We symbolize things and we do certain things like I'm doing right now. I'm using a complex system of symbols to communicate really complex ideas that you understand 100% of because we're all on the same page, literally, right? We all are using the same encoded system of complex symbols. Music is a classic example of that same system, right? And in fact, the relationship between, say, mathematics and music, to me, is basically a matter of notation. It's the same thing, but it uses different systems of notation. Now, I'm choosing stone tools to demonstrate a point to you because on this table up here, I have some of the very earliest products of human technology, these hand axes up here, which go back in East Africa 1.5 million years. Or some, these particular ones are about 1 million years younger than that, so around 400,000, but they're still very old. They go back to about 1.5 million years, and are among some of the earliest human technologies. And yet I would argue that even in those simplest technologies produced by people, and I'm sort of hesitating here because it depends on the definition of people, but people of a species that is different than ours. Homo erectus, right, our direct ancestor, but not even Homo sapiens, not even Neanderthals, right, but in fact a much earlier clade of human evolution, are nonetheless encoding through symbols things in these artifacts that belie their function. So archaeologists don't even call these things hand axes anymore because they probably weren't held directly in the hand, and they certainly weren't used to chop down trees. So we refer to them as large cutting tools or something very generic like that. But what it demonstrates, and if you look at the blow-in page illustration in your little notebook there, I've illustrated this for you. This is an illustration of one of the prides of the British Museum in London, right? I mean, there's the Rosetta Stone, and there's the Elgin marbles and stuff, but there's also this hand axe. And it's on display, but it's tucked away in the Stone Age rooms of the BM. And what it displays is something which I think is hard to argue is not early symbolic behavior. It's a hand axe like one of these. But right in the center of it, as you can see, someone has very carefully removed the outlying stone to expose this fossilized mollusk shell, geometrically right in the middle of that. Now, if this were a one-off thing, you could sort of say somebody got lucky or whatever, but there are actually 3 of these now from various places scattered across Europe, suggesting that there was as early as maybe 500,000 years ago, something emergent outside of Africa in Europe that is sort of putting emphasis not just on the production of stone tools to accomplish a task, but to use it to communicate an idea. So I don't know what that idea was, but I'm interested in finding out. So part of what I've done as my research is to go around and look at stone artifacts like these in lots of different museum collections. I've excavated a number of sites myself that have artifacts like these in them, looking for evidence of that kind of symbolic behavior. And I mean, obviously, you're not allowed to sort of take things home with you, but I do have a couple of artifacts that indicate sort of what I'm talking about. Maybe the best example is this object, which you can come up and look at after I'm sort of finished here in a minute, which is a sandstone hand axe, which I think has been carefully flayed to expose this really interesting color change here between the dark bottom and the light top. And the site that we excavated, this comes from a site in, actually, you know, I'm not quite sure whether it's the southernmost part of Egypt or the northernmost part of Sudan. This was done in a period of time before GPSs, and we were using a sextant, and I'm not totally sure where it is, but sort of on the Egyptian-Sudanese border, in which there are hundreds of artifacts like these.
So you think it's been tricked out?
Oh, I think it's been totally tricked out, absolutely. To exhibit this interesting change in color. Now, if you look at a similar artifact from the same site, made on a very homogeneous raw material, you can also make the argument that the symmetry alone is reflecting something about the human mind's propensity to make things symmetrical. Is there a functional reason to make this symmetrical? Maybe. But by and large, you could accomplish the same task with an asymmetrical tool. I also have up here for you to look at some artifacts from my current work in Tibet and in Mongolia, where we're finding evidence, these are much younger tools, and I chose them for the specific reason that they demonstrate repetitiveness of manufacture. I can't really hold this up very far, or else everything will slip to the bottom, and I really don't want that to happen. So you'll have to come up and sort of look at them afterwards, and they're too small to, you in the front row couldn't see them, let alone folks in the back. But they demonstrate a conscious, the conscious act of repetitiveness to produce something that essentially we would think of as a template, right? A mental template. And in producing stone tools, which is actually a very complicated process, even something as simple as this, I mean, I can make something like this. I can't make a lot of these things because I'm just not technically proficient enough. But even to make something like this requires thinking ahead hundreds of steps, right? Because you're removing each of these hundreds of flakes and you're flipping it over and doing the same thing on the other side to achieve a model that somebody is passing on. That's the communicative, multi-generational part of the culture thing, in a way that's persisting, mind you. Those of you who are cranky that you don't have an iPhone 5, iPhone 4, and that, I'm upset now because I'm still on Windows 7. Oh my God. That this is a technology that persisted for over 1 million years in virtually an unchanged state, right? Now, if you go back to Homo erectus, we're talking about maximum age limits of maybe 50 years. 50 years would be unimaginably old. More like 30 to 40 years would be an incredibly old individual. So do the math. How many 30-year generations can you fit into 1 million years that this is getting passed down essentially without modification in a way that I would argue is actually impossible for modern human beings to understand, because our frame of reference, I mean, the news cycle is now measured in minutes, right? I mean, I think last time I checked, the news cycle was, a couple of hours, and when I was a kid, the news cycle was like 24 hours or something. I mean, I know Kennedy got shot probably within about 12 hours of it happening, those kinds of things. Now the news cycle is, you know, just a matter of minutes, and we're upset and concerned when everything isn't resolved in some sort of time frame that fits that sort of heightened expectation. These objects reflect a very different pattern that is nonetheless as universally human as is our sort of way of using technology in ways that satisfy our heightened expectations. I only ask you to think about, as you sort of look at the stuff I'm, you know, passing on to you as a takeaway, and then obviously doing the additional reading afterward, is to, yeah, exactly, there's your Christmas holiday right there, is to sort of think about the commonalities of the structure of culture being this highly flexible mechanism that allows adaptation, and the mechanism for that adaptation is symbolizing. So is this a symbol? Yeah, I think it is. I don't have any idea what it symbolizes. That's the problem, because this is a prehistoric context. I cannot go to a text and say, aha, in the patent records, in whatever it is, I know what this symbolizes beyond its functional meaning. That fact, I should say just the fact that I'm proposing that this has symbolic value, as do all of these other things beyond their function, actually is the segue to pollen. Because there are two aspects of the human experience which are very tightly related to one another and which overlap in ways that allow this kind of expressive symbolism to take place. And those two things are language and music, if you want to separate music from language for the moment and as a separate endeavor. Simply because they are extremely complex, they allow a great deal of flexibility, and they allow sort of achieving the ultimate goal of the human endeavor in general, which is to translate a lot of things that we do. All right, it's cold, I have to wear clothes, right? So why am I not dressed in a tracksuit? Because that would be culturally inappropriate in this context, right? There are other contexts in which that would be totally appropriate. Why are all the men in this room basically dressed the same? Did we call each other up beforehand and say, make sure it's the dark suit? You know, no, it's because we know, you know what? But no, we're in Tucson, so never mind that. All bets are off, right? It would be problematical if we were not in Tucson. But understand those rules, and yet something as necessary, as mundane as just protecting yourself from the elements becomes this very complex thing of communication, right? So I have friends who tell me I look like a professor because I wear the clothes that I wear. Okay, fine. I actually don't have a problem with that because I'm a professor. So what am I trying to look like? You know? So, you know, the issue here is that if we look finally then at culture as an adaptive mechanism and use that section grapefruit model, suddenly it becomes possible for things like this to take on meaning beyond just their sort of mundane, I need to butcher an elephant kind of rationale, and think about the cultural context in which objects like that exist. So, you know, I'm not trying to convert you to archaeology or anything. I'm just saying, you know, for the next few days, while it's kind of fresh in your mind, you know, as you're going through your daily life using objects, take a second and think about this and sort of say, well, you know, why am I using a Mont Blanc fountain pen instead of a 49-cent Bic? Bic actually works a lot better in Tucson because it's so damn dry here. You know, why am I doing that? What is this, you know, as you get into your car, what are the decisions that you made about that car? Is it a purely selfish thing that you don't give a darn what anybody else thinks about what you're driving? You want to drive that 1960s Volkswagen Beetle because you've always driven a 1960s, whatever. Or is it the opposite, right? What is being communicated by those simple, seemingly simple everyday acts? And I think if you think through that process a little bit, you'll freak yourself out, so don't do it too long. You'll start reading meaning into every little thing. But secondly, it'll help you get at the notion that some of us are devoting our lives to, which is, for better or worse, trying to squeeze meaning out of stone tools, right? Like, so, okay, now I can stick that thing under a microscope and I can basically tell you what it was used for. It leaves microscopic traces. I can tell you whether it was used to butcher an elephant or chop down a tree. I can tell you that. That's not very interesting anymore. What's interesting is, what about the rest of the darn section grapefruit that these things were wiggling around in as part of their function in transmitting